Hi, in this session, we're going to be talking about drugs. And so to begin with, just grab a hold of your paper and pen. And I'd like you to look at these few questions. So pause the video right here, look at these questions, and write down your own answers to these five. And at the end of this session, I want you to revisit these questions and check to see how close you were. Some of these are, of course, your own views, but take your time to write down some points about this. So you can pause the video here and continue after a few minutes. Okay, now if you've got your answers to this, let's have a look at what our syllabus tells us about drugs and the answers to some of this. To begin with, to put it officially in a definition, a drug is any substance taken into the body that modifies or affects chemical reactions in the body. You might want to take that down. Yeah, it's any substance taken into the body that modifies or affects chemical reactions in the body. And so when you talk about categories of drugs, now I'm going to be listing a lot of these categories over here. As far as our syllabus goes, we need only a few of them. But no harm being aware of the different categories of these drugs. So firstly, we have stimulants. These are also called uppers, because as this tells you, these speed up the body's nervous system and create a feeling of energy. A common example of this is coffee. Coffee contains caffeine. So caffeine is a kind of drug, it's a stimulant. And that's why they tell you if you want to stay awake late in the night, caffeine is a good idea, because it makes you feel very awake. It creates a feeling of energy. Okay, hence they are also called uppers. You've got other examples of this. Of course, that doesn't mean to stay awake, you need to take one of these ones, because these are not the very healthy or helpful ones. Yeah, because these are going to make you addicted to them. Not that caffeine doesn't make you addicted, but it's comparatively mild. The second category that we have are called inhalants. As the name suggests, these have to be sniffed, yeah, breathed in, and these give the user immediate results because it goes directly into your blood vessels and therefore will get into your brain. Unfortunately, these immediate results can also result in sudden mental damage, can affect your liver, lung, as well as kidneys. It affects the sense of smell, obviously, because you're inhaling it most of the time. It causes difficulty in walking and confusion because obviously this is affecting your brain. Examples of these are glues and paint thinners. They say a lot of people who get onto drugs begin by doing this, sniffing glue. Yeah, not to be recommended. A third category is depressants. Again, as the name suggests, these slow down the activity of the central nervous system. So they actually give you a feeling of relaxation. The opposite of uppers, stimulants kind of give you a sense of energy. These are called downers. They slow the body down. And a common example of this is alcohol. And that's why very often people say that whenever they drink alcohol, that kind of relaxes them, gives them a kind of a relaxed kind of a feeling. Now, some of these depressants are also available as prescription drugs, which means they are obviously legal, okay, but can only be prescribed by doctors to relieve stress, anger, etc. However, the side effect of it is drowsiness, which means obviously you cannot be having these and perhaps driving or doing any activity that requires you to be a lot more alert and active. And hence, they say, do not drink and drive. The fourth category are opioids and morphines. These again cause drowsiness, confusion, nausea, feelings of euphoria, extreme happiness, as well as respiratory complications, and they relieve pain. So again, can be used as prescription drugs by doctors to relieve extreme pain. You would have probably heard of morphines being used to relieve pain. Yeah, examples of these are opium, heroin, morphine, codeine, and fentanyl. However, when you see the drowsiness, confusion, you should know it again affects your brain and your central nervous system. The next category are anabolic steroids. I'm sure you guys have heard of these also. People who want to build a good physique, to enlarge muscles, increase strength, they use anabolic steroids. We'll talk about these in more detail. They're also taken to improve physical performance. So athletes who want to win at any cost may resort to these. However, there are negative effects of these, includes baldness, cysts, oily hair, skin, acne, hair attack, stroke, and change in voice. A frequent side effect is also hostility. People on steroids tend to be very angry, very hostile. As I said, we'll talk about more of these in detail. The next category are hallucinogens. Again, these give the appearance of things that are not really there. They give you a good kind of feeling. They affect the body's self-control, such as speech and movement. And so they say people are able to shed their inhibitions when they have this. You might have heard of magic mushrooms over here. Or earlier there was something called LSD that was very popular. But the side effects of these drugs are heart failure, increased heart rate, high blood pressure, and changes in the different body's hormones. And the last one that we have are prescription drugs. These are basically helpful drugs. When used properly and under the guidance of a qualified physician, can be used to help in surgery, to treat medical conditions, as well as to control various symptoms. And antibiotics would come under this. So generally when we use the word drugs, they have a negative connotation. But from what you would have heard, some of these drugs are helpful and have been used to help in certain conditions. At the same time, a majority of these drugs have negative effects, as you would have seen. And therefore, unless prescribed by a physician, a doctor, you are advised not to take any of these. Okay. Now, looking at these categories again, in our syllabus, we basically talk about stimulants, depressants, anabolic steroids, and a little bit about prescription drugs. The others are just for your awareness, as these categories cover all the different drugs that are available. Now, to begin with, let's have a look at antibiotics. We've already covered this, the definition of drugs. And so when we look at antibiotics, antibiotics are basically chemical substances produced by microorganisms, which is bacteria or fungi, that kill or inhibit the growth of other microorganisms. There is this famous story here about Alexander Fleming and how he accidentally discovered the very first antibiotic, which is penicillin. Seemingly, he had Petri dishes of a particular bacteria that he was working on. So he had dishes filled with these bacteria, Petri dishes filled with these bacteria, and he had been studying these ones. Now, one weekend, he left his Petri dishes lying on the desk and he walked off for the weekend. When he came back on a Monday, as the story goes, he found that in certain patches, his bacteria were missing. So there were kind of certain patches where his bacteria seemed to have died off. Now he was very curious as to what exactly caused his bacteria to die off. Now he could have always washed off his dishes without even questioning it, and antibiotics might not have been discovered till much later. But as it goes, being a curious scientist, he studied this part under the microscope and he found a certain fungus growing there. A fungus called Penicillium notatum. Penicillium notatum. Notice whenever we write scientific names, the capital P for the genus name, small n for the species name, and underline them separately. So he found this fungus called Penicillium notatum growing there, and he deduced that this fungus was therefore producing some chemical that was killing his bacteria. And after some study, he and his researchers named it penicillin, and that came to be the very first antibiotic. So now if you're looking at that definition, it should make a whole lot more sense. Penicillin was the very first antibiotic. It was a chemical substance produced by a microorganism, in this case Penicillium notatum, that killed his bacterium. Okay, so antibiotics could be killing the bacterium or inhibiting, that is slowing down the growth of other microorganisms. That's what antibiotics are. And that's why they are called antibiotic, against life. And so antibiotics slowly started gaining popularity for treating bacterial infections. Because basically what these antibiotics would do is break down the cell walls of bacteria. And therefore bacteria cannot carry out their metabolic actions. Now that is also a reason why antibiotics kill bacteria, but they can't affect viruses. Viruses do not have a cell wall. They have a protein coat, if you remember. And therefore antibiotics do not work on bacteria. Yeah, that takes care of these 2 points that we've got over here in our syllabus. But one of the other things that had been happening in the last few years is something called antibiotic resistance. And we need to be aware of that. So let me talk to you about this. Now there are 2, I would say, dirty habits that most of us have. One is, whenever you are ill, you may go along directly to a medical and ask for antibiotics without going to a doctor. And therefore you end up using antibiotics even when they are not really essential. And second is that when a doctor prescribes a course of antibiotics for you, let's say for 5 days, you start feeling better after 2 or 3 days, so you stop taking it. So you stop taking your course, you don't complete your course. Now these 2 habits are the reason for this popping up. So what exactly is this antibiotic resistance? Let me explain it this way. Imagine there are some bacteria that are causing a particular infection. So these bacteria have got into your body and they are causing an infection. So a doctor prescribes some medication for you and you start taking the antibiotic. The doctor has prescribed 5 days of the antibiotic medicine. You started taking it. On day 1, some of the bacteria die out because you've been taking the antibiotic. Now the rest continue reproducing. As they reproduce, the second day some more bacteria die out. Now what happens is the ones that are weaker get killed by the antibiotic. Some of these bacteria have a little more resistance to the antibiotic and therefore they continue surviving. And they continue reproducing. The third day some more bacteria are dying out. But the more resistant ones are still surviving and they continue replicating or reproducing. I hope you are figuring out what I'm coming to. By day 3, there are few bacteria left and therefore you feel like your infection is getting cured. And therefore you stop taking the medicine. But did you notice what has happened over here? The most resistant ones have survived. And therefore since you stop taking the antibiotic, these fellows will continue. They may not affect you. They may have passed on to somebody else, but they are now the ones that are the most resistant to this antibiotic. And now when they reproduce, they will replicate and form more of their kind who are equally resistant. You get the point? There should be some phrase or some term popping up in your head right now, something to do with Darwin, if you are following my train of thought. Yeah, if you got this right, this is basically natural selection. It's as though the bacteria that were the fittest in this sense, the ones that were resistant to the antibiotic, they were the fittest. They survived. The weaker ones died out. And so as a result of natural selection, what has happened is we have got bacteria that are a little more resistant to that antibiotic. And so with time, if more people keep doing this, slowly the bacteria, due to natural selection, are getting antibiotic resistance. I hope you're getting the point. It's not that the bacteria are changing in order to resist that antibiotic. It's just by some freak chance, due to variation, due to some mutation that has occurred in them, some of them happen to have a little more resistance. Now, if you had continued taking that antibiotic for 5 days, probably a lot more of those bacteria, maybe all of those bacteria would have died. But because we've stopped it over there, we end up getting resistant bacteria. And so this antibiotic, after a few years, will be pretty ineffective. And so today they are looking at a lot of these antibiotics that have been used for years, and we probably will have to just throw them out and start all over again and create new antibiotics for these new resistant variants of bacteria. Okay? And one such example of resistant bacteria that is common today is something called MRSA, or they call it MRSA. MRSA, the full form of it, I've put it up here for you, methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. But I suppose MRSA is simpler and accepted in our boards also. As this states, we need to be able to explain how development of resistant bacteria such as MRSA can be minimized, limited to using antibiotics only when essential. Remember the two habits we spoke about, not randomly picking them off the shelf or taking them from the medical and taking them at any time, but only when essential. And secondly, ensuring that the course is completed, the treatment is completed. These two steps will ensure that these resistant bacteria are not formed. And I hope this part is also clear, that some bacteria are resistant to antibiotics. This reduces the effectiveness of those antibiotics. Okay, and in this context, I hope you've also understood how natural selection kind of plays a role. Although here it's not really nature as such, it's humans, because we are taking those antibiotics and therefore bringing about the selection. Now, going ahead, let's move on to the second category that we have, which is alcohol. Alcohol is a powerful depressant drug. And if you remember, we call them downers. Yeah, because it slows down signals in your nerves and the brain. And because it slows down the signals, it increases reaction times. And now you understand why they say you should not drink and drive. Because it increases reaction times. As we also said, being a depressant drug, it slows down the system and gives you a feeling of relaxation and calming. However, if you're stressed out, I'm not recommending this to you at any stage, yes? The reason it does that is also it releases a hormone called dopamine. Now, dopamine, which is produced by your brain, gives you a sense of positivity, gives you positive feelings. However, here, dopamine makes your body crave more alcohol. And therefore, very often you can't stop with one drink. It makes you crave even more. A second hormone that it affects is serotonin, which your body produces, which plays a role in things like mood and sleep. And therefore, having a lot of alcohol could affect your sleeping patterns, could also affect your mood. Now, while some of the long-term effects are that with time, a person develops a kind of tolerance, which means earlier, a person used to feel kind of happy, in inverted commas, or kind of high, used to experience a high with maybe 2 drinks or 3 drinks. Now, with time, they experience lesser pleasure, and therefore they develop a tolerance, which means the next time, 3 drinks don't make a major difference. The person has to have a 4th one, and maybe slowly a 5th one. So each time the person needs more of the drink to get the same feeling, to experience that high. And that is how addiction develops. And that is why it's dangerous. Now, if you look at alcohol on its own, in small quantities, not at your age, at my age, it's considered to be good. It's supposed to be good for the functioning of the heart. It's supposed to be good to also ensure that cholesterol does not collect. But on the negative side, it's very difficult to stop at 1 or 2 drinks. Addiction develops. And so if a person tries to stop having alcohol after a while, there are withdrawal symptoms. Now, some of the other long-term effects are also it damages the liver. Now, here we need to be aware that liver is able to break down alcohol. Liver has an enzyme which specifically breaks down alcohol. So if you remember, when we spoke about the digestive system, from the stomach and the intestine, there is a blood vessel that takes things to the liver. I hope you remember the name of this blood vessel. Think about it. Okay, got it? It's the hepatic portal vein. Now this carries stuff that has been digested to the liver, like glucose, amino acids, etc. It also carries alcohol to the liver. As soon as you've consumed alcohol, once it reaches your stomach and intestine, it gets absorbed and it goes to the liver. The liver contains an enzyme to break this down. But the problem is, the liver can only break down a limited amount of alcohol at a time. Ideally, that's something like 500 ml of beer in an hour. Or maybe a drink, about let's say 40-50 ml, I think, in an hour. But the problem is when a person drinks, it's very difficult to limit yourself to 40-50 ml in an hour. But if you do, your liver is handling it well. But when you happen to drink more than that, then what tends to happen is that excess alcohol that you drink, it gets past the liver, if you remember, via the hepatic vein, and then it gets circulated around your blood and it can affect your brain. And that is what actually causes a person to start feeling that high, because alcohol now starts affecting the brain. It has got past the liver. Now, although we say liver can break down alcohol, when it breaks down alcohol, it produces toxins which are kind of stored in the liver. And that causes the liver to get affected. It causes scarring of the liver, leading to something called cirrhosis, a breaking down of the liver. And if a person becomes an alcoholic, part by part, the liver is getting affected in this way with the toxins collecting there, and a person could die due to liver cirrhosis. Yeah? Alcohol can also damage the brain, causes memory loss, poorer self-control. And so just in order to get more alcohol, a person can become aggressive, get into robbery, crime, etc., just in order to get more money, in order to feed his or her alcohol habit. And here, therefore, they say alcohol makes it very difficult for people to hold on to their jobs, and therefore they land up with this kind of crime, families break up, etc. Right? Now, these are the long-term effects. In the short term, if a person has alcohol, too much of alcohol can lead to vomiting. This is something that also happens after you've taken a lot of alcohol. Maybe the next morning this could happen. This is what we would call a hangover. In the short term, it can also impair a person's judgment. Again, going back to why you should not drink and drive. A person could become more violent. There is a loss in balance and muscular coordination because it's affecting that part of your brain, which we call the cerebellum, which handles muscle coordination and balance. Also makes you fairly sleepy. We said it is a downer, a depressant. Now, coincidentally, heroin works very much the same way. Heroin is also a depressant drug. It does the very same things. It slows down signals in the nerves and brain and increases reaction times. Also, with respect to heroin, addiction also develops the same way, and a person has the same withdrawal symptoms. And in order to get more of the substance, a person could become aggressive and get into robbery, crime, etc. One of the other things about alcohol is, you've probably heard that a pregnant woman is normally told not to have alcohol. Now, the reason for that is alcohol could go via the placenta and the umbilical cord into the baby as it's developing, and this could have major effects on the developing baby. It could affect the development of the brain itself and have other repercussions if a pregnant woman were to have a lot of alcohol. Okay, now if you've understood what I told you about alcohol and heroin, you should be able to answer this little board question. Pause the video for a while and see if you can scribble down this table and fill it up. You can pause it now. Okay, now if you guess the answer to this, addiction, yes, alcohol, you can get addicted to alcohol. Heroin is the same, we said. Both of them are depressants, we said that also. And yes, we already know that alcohol causes liver damage, liver cirrhosis when used in excess. Now you're already told that heroin also does the same. So in many ways, both these work the same way in our body. Going ahead, we move on to the next one that we have, which is smoking. Of course, smoking is not a drug, and it wasn't put under one of those categories that we spoke about. But one of the ingredients of smoking is nicotine, which is a drug, and which is why it has been included in this module itself. Okay, so one of the things that smoking causes is something called COPD, which stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. If you're good with words, no harm knowing this entire thing. Otherwise, COPD is accepted. So this is supposed to be a kind of an umbrella term, a big term for a lot of lung-related diseases like bronchitis, emphysema. You would have heard some of these terms before related to the lung. They all come under COPD, and smoking can cause COPD, which means a person can get emphysema, bronchitis, etc. Okay, it can also cause CHD. If you've heard the term, it's coronary heart disease, which means not only is it affecting the lungs, it can also affect your heart, and it can cause lung cancer. But going ahead, you'll find out lungs are not the only thing that get affected. A person could also get tongue cancer, cancer of the mouth, thorax, etc. To begin with, the chemicals that are there in cigarette, there are three main chemicals in cigarette that you need to be aware of. The first one is tar. Now, tar is a carcinogen. I'm sure you're aware what that means. It causes cancer. It's a substance that causes cancer. And as I just mentioned a little while ago, tar can cause cancer of the lungs, the trachea, the mouth, the tongue, the stomach, the liver. It's a kind of a sticky substance. As you can see in this picture, it kind of forms a coating along your whole respiratory tract. And therefore, the goblet cells that are lining your respiratory tract end up producing more mucus. With more mucus getting collected over there, what tends to happen is it gets deposited slowly in the alveoli, which are supposed to be for gas exchange. But because of the presence of this mucus over there, the diffusion surface for gas exchange is reduced. And so such people experience persistent coughing due to this tar. It also leads to something called emphysema, which we mentioned. This picture should seem familiar. We've spoken about this earlier. That's where the walls between the alveoli get attacked by the body's WBCs itself. And therefore the diffusion surface for the gases which are required for respiration is reduced. Compare the one on the left-hand side, where it's complete, to this one, where the walls are missing. That's emphysema. As for bronchitis, it's basically the mucus collecting along the airways and reducing the space for the gas exchange. Now, one more thing that could be added over here is this can also damage the cilia that are present. Now, this is all about the first chemical itself. We said there are three chemicals in cigarettes. Actually, there are plenty of chemicals in cigarettes, but the three most important ones and the dangerous ones that we need to be aware of for our syllabus also. One is tar. The second one is nicotine, which is the drug actually. It is an addictive substance. This is what makes a person addicted to smoking. You start off with one, you like the feeling of it, you don't want to stop. Yeah. One of the other things it also does is it narrows down your blood vessels. Smoking, they say, hardens your blood vessels. Arteriosclerosis, if you remember, where the arteries harden and therefore blood can't flow easily through them, and therefore your blood pressure is raised. And that's how smoking can cause high BP, because the blood vessels have lost their elasticity, particularly the arteries. It also paralyzes the cilia that are present. Right? Now, in addition to tar and nicotine, even the very fact that when you're inhaling the smoke, it is hot, that heat can also damage the cilia. Right? And the third chemical that we have is carbon monoxide. Now, this should ring a bell in your head. If you remember, we've said that carbon monoxide has a fantastic affinity for some chemical that's present in your blood. If you remembered it right, it has a fantastic affinity for hemoglobin, because it ends up forming a very, very stable compound called carboxyhemoglobin. You need to be aware of this. Now, this is such a stable compound that this hemoglobin, which should have actually been carrying oxygen, ends up forming a very stable compound It bonds with carbon monoxide because it has a fantastic affinity for it, and therefore there is no more hemoglobin free to carry any oxygen. And therefore it reduces the oxygen carrying capacity of blood. And therefore this is almost like inhaling the exhaust fumes that come out of vehicles, which is basically carbon monoxide itself. And so if you're getting the point, there are several chemicals in cigarettes, but these three are enough to give you an idea that smoking is really a bad idea. Now, just like alcohol, you've also probably heard that pregnant women should not ideally smoke. That's because some of these substances can be transferred via the placenta again to the little fetus, to the little baby growing within the woman. These toxins can cross the placenta, leading to increased risks of miscarriage. So during the pregnancy itself, the woman could lose the baby, or the baby that is delivered may be a dead baby or a stillbirth, that's what it's called. Or there could be even deformities because of these chemicals. It reduces the oxygen available to the fetus, you know why. Therefore, it can cause fetal brain damage and also reduce lung function. All of this leads to low birth weight and even an increased risk of asthma in babies. And if this is not scary enough, look at these three graphs. Now you could pause the video here again. Look at each of these graphs and try and analyze them and see what they are trying to say. Now in your exams, very often they give different kind of graphs related to smoking, deaths, etc. And you are asked to analyze these graphs, maybe describe what it shows, or even explain why something is happening. So pause the video here and look at the graphs and make a few notes for yourself based on each graph. You can pause it now. Okay, so if you're looking at the first one, it shows you the kind of risk that is involved in terms of a percentage in terms of getting lung cancer. So they say for a person who's never smoked at the age of 75, very low risk. Okay, all along you can see the risk is very low because there could be some other factors leading to it also. But in the case of a person who's stopped at the age of 30, the risk factor is gradually increasing. However, at the age of 75, there is still not very much of a risk as compared to a person who stopped much later at the age of 50. But for a person who never stopped smoking, at the age of 75, the risk of getting cancer is very high. And you can notice that because the person continued smoking, at every stage, the risk is pretty high. Now, moving on to the second graph, if you're looking at the second graph, it compares the risk of death in men and in women. And as you can see, there's a higher chance in men dying of lung cancer than women. And that too depends on the number of cigarettes a person smokes in a day. So the fewer cigarettes you smoke in a day, the percentage of death is lesser. The more you smoke in a day, the higher the chance. Always a little higher for men than women. But of course, for a non-smoker, the chances are very minimal if you're talking about lung cancer. Okay, and a third graph here shows you over the years the number of cigarettes that were consumed, a graph that was maintained, and along with it, the number of lung cancer deaths. And if you notice, there's a kind of a pattern. Whenever this increased, this also increased. After a while, it has been identified that there's approximately a 20-year gap there because the person obviously would have continued smoking for 20 years or so. So as the number of cigarettes smoked increases, the number of cancer deaths have increased. As the number of cigarette smokes drops, you can see this number also dropping. So very obviously, cigarette smoking is linked up with lung cancer. And if all of what I've said hasn't frightened you enough about smoking, here's one last try to scare you. Smoking actually damages every part of your body. On the left-hand side, you can see the different cancers that can be caused. On the right side, you can see the different chronic diseases. Bottom line, smoking is a horrible idea. Alcohol, there are some positives to it if taken in small quantities. Again, at my age, not your age. But smoking at any age, totally bad idea. Okay, with that, let's move on to the last group that we have, anabolic steroids. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with that term, anabolic. We've done it before. Anabolic involves building up. So here, anabolic steroids increase muscle mass and strength. And if you look at these two pictures, definitely for males, who wouldn't want to have a physique like this? But it's not easy building this kind of a physique with pure exercise and protein and a good diet. In order to have this kind of a crazy physique, people very often resort to anabolic steroids. And in the case of women, again to build this kind of a physique, a muscular physique, anabolic steroids would be used. Now, the reason is testosterone is the hormone that is required for building up of muscle. And in the case of women, there's very less testosterone produced by the body. So although a male and female may exercise the same amount, may do the same exercises with more or less the same intensity, eat the same kind of diet, a woman still would not build up as much muscle mass as the male, obviously because the male has more testosterone. And therefore, women who want to have a very muscular physique, they end up going for anabolic steroids. Okay, so coming back again, anabolic steroids increase muscle mass and strength. Testosterone is a natural anabolic steroids. All the rest that are around are mostly synthetic versions of this testosterone. Now, while it may feel great to have a physique like this, there are a lot of negatives to this. And I'm going to talk about some of those. Again, based on those, you realize it's not really worth taking some of these anabolic steroids. However, on the positive side, anabolic steroids reduce muscle damage and promote muscle repair. So a person who takes these steroids can actually train for longer time and therefore work out much harder. They're able to push a lot more weight. They're able to run longer maybe. But on the negative side, one of the first things that get affected, of course, is the liver. Because if you remember, from stomach and intestines, everything go to the liver. And therefore, liver bears the brunt of most of these things. So liver abnormalities and tumors. With anabolic steroids, a person could also get decreased good cholesterol and increased LDL, which means obviously it can lead to heart-related issues. Yeah, because your cholesterol shoots up. You get high blood pressure. A person ends up being aggressive because testosterone is linked up with aggressiveness. And that is why even when young adolescents, when you reach puberty, suddenly the person starts becoming very aggressive, etc. because testosterone is increasing in the body. So an injection of testosterone would lead to more aggressiveness, also leads to depression. Now these are common in males and females, these side effects. But specifically in males, due to anabolic steroids, prominent breasts develop. A person could slowly start becoming bald, lose hair, testicles shrink, person becomes infertile, impotent, which means basically incapable of having children. The prostate gland enlarges. So these are specifically for males, whereas in females, it could lead to a deeper voice because testosterone is generally considered a male hormone, increased body hair, baldness, and infrequent or absent periods. It's as though the male quotient in a female is increasing. And therefore, you want a physique like that, you've got to do it the hard way. You may not totally reach that level of bulkiness, but good exercise, a good diet, intake of the proper supplements with protein powder, etc., would get you very much there. You don't need to rely on anabolic steroids. However, there's a specific class of anabolic steroids called designer drugs. These are supposed to be synthetic steroids that have been created so that they won't be detected by the current drug tests. And they have been made specifically for athletes, for those who want to win something at any cost. Yeah, but you see the cost that is involved over here. These are said to have no medical use as such, these designer drugs. And with that, we come to the end of drugs. And we've had a look at 4 major components that we need to be aware of as far as our syllabus goes. So looking quickly at what our syllabus requires, it says describe the effects of excessive alcohol consumption and abuse of heroin, limited to them being powerful depressant drugs, done. Effect on reaction times and self-control, addiction and withdrawal symptoms. Negative social implications, such as robbery, crime, etc., which we spoke about. Yeah. Heroin affects the nervous system, we said that, limited to its effect on the function of synapses. A synapse, if you remember, was this gap that was present, right, between 2 neurons. If you remember, there were receptors present neurotransmitter receptors present over here. Now, these axon endings are supposed to be containing neurotransmitters, those chemicals, if you remember, within vesicles. Now, one of these neurotransmitters is a group called endorphins. And so there are endorphin receptors present this side also. So that when endorphins are released, they will fit into this, they get converted into electricity, and they go down the neuron. Now, when a person consumes heroin, this heroin seemingly gets converted by the brain into morphine. And this morphine is said to fit into these endorphin receptors as well. And endorphins generally give a person a sensation of pleasure or feeling nice. It reduces sensations of pain, etc. And so when a person takes heroin, and the heroin, which gets converted to morphine, fits into these same receptors, a person experiences the same feelings as taking endorphins, and so does not feel pain, gets a sensation of calming, nice, happy feeling. And so with time it is said that fewer endorphins get produced as a person takes heroin more frequently. And that's the reason why a person needs to take more and more heroin each time to get the same feeling of high. Okay, so briefly, that is something that you need to be aware of over here. Now, going further, heroin can be injected, which means, of course, there is a chance of getting infections such as HIV. Because in the case of drug users, very often they are not even aware, they could end up using each other's needles. State that excessive alcohol consumption can cause liver damage. We did that. We spoke about liver cirrhosis as well as cancer. State that tobacco smoking can cause COPD, lung cancer, and coronary heart disease. We did that. We just need to name these things. Yeah? Discuss the evidence. We looked at the graphs that showed the link between smoking and lung cancer. Describe the effects on the gas exchange system of tobacco smoke and its major toxic components limited to number 1, number 2, and number 3. Make sure you got all 3 of them. You know their effects. And finally, discuss the use of hormones to improve sporting performance, limited to testosterone and anabolic steroids. I hope you've got all of that. Yeah. With that, we come to an end of drugs. What I'd suggest is now you go back to those questions that we started with. And at the end of this, I hope your answers to those questions will be fairly different. Okay? Ciao.